The clanking of metal chains and the low rumble of a diesel engine tore through the quiet Sunday morning. I stood barefoot on my driveway, coffee mug trembling in my hand, watching as the tow truck operator looped a heavy steel hook onto the hitch of my RV. My RV. The one I'd spent years restoring, every dent and scratch a piece of my history. And at the center of it all, leaning against her perfectly trimmed boxwood hedge, was Karen, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched high, lips curled into that smug, paper-thin smile I'd come to know too well. She didn't even bother looking at me. Her voice cut through the air, sharp and bureaucratic. It's against HOA regulations. Vehicles over 20 feet can't be stored in the driveway. You were notified. Her words carried the kind of detached finality only someone who enjoyed enforcing rules could deliver. I reminded her, calmly at first, that the RV wasn't stored. I was prepping it for a trip. 2 days, maybe 3, before it would be gone. She didn't care. She waved a folded letter in my face like it was a royal decree. The ink still smelling fresh from the HOA office printer. The tow truck roared to life, straining against the weight of the vehicle that had been my escape from life's chaos. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't just about a vehicle. It was about control. Then, like divine timing, the sheriff's SUV pulled up. Tires crunching over gravel, lights flashing lazily. He stepped out, read the paperwork, and I, without so much as a glance at Karen, turned to the tow operator and said, "Move it," to her driveway. For a moment, Karen froze, literally froze. Her sunglasses slipped just enough for me to see her eyes widen, that mask of superiority cracking. The tow truck driver shrugged, swung the RV around, and with the kind of slow, deliberate precision that makes a point, backed it up right into Karen's pristine concrete drive. By the time the chains clinked free, the neighborhood had gathered, phones out, whispers spreading, and in that strange, surreal moment, I knew this wasn't the end. This was the opening shot of a war I hadn't asked for, but one I was suddenly ready to fight. When my wife, Emily, and I moved into Willow Creek Estates 2 years ago, peace was all we were looking for. After 15 years in a cramped city apartment, the idea of a quiet cul-de-sac, a small backyard for weekend barbecues, and neighbors who waved instead of honked felt like a dream we'd finally earned. We had no illusions about perfection. We'd seen enough real estate brochures to know the glossy photos were only half the truth. But the neighborhood had charm. Maple trees lined the sidewalks like sentinels, and every spring, the air smelled faintly of jasmine from the hedges that framed the entryway. It wasn't the kind of place you expected drama to thrive. Our home was modest, 3 bedrooms, one of which doubled as my work-from-home office, and a garage just big enough to hold my tools, and the RV that had been my pet project for years. The RV wasn't a monster, just 22 feet, vintage but fully restored, and it wasn't an eyesore. In fact, more than a few neighbors had complimented it when they saw it gleaming in the sun. We kept to ourselves at first, learning names, sharing polite greetings. Emily baked cookies for the folks next door, and I helped an elderly couple, the Martins, fix their leaky fence. Slowly, we started to feel like part of the fabric of the place. That was before we met Karen. She was introduced to us by another neighbor with an odd mix of respect and quiet dread. She's on the HOA board. Actually, she is the HOA board. That turned out not to be an exaggeration. Karen wasn't officially the president. That role rotated every year, but her influence was absolute. It was the way she walked into conversations like she was auditing them, how she kept a clipboard under her arm like a police officer keeps a sidearm. Our first interaction wasn't even in person. It came as a letter, neatly folded in a HOA-branded envelope, informing us that our trash bin had been visible from the street for more than 24 hours after collection day. A violation. I didn't think much of it. Mistakes happen. But a week later, another letter arrived, this time about a non-compliant flower bed. According to Karen, the HOA bylaws specified that all visible flora had to conform to the community's harmonized aesthetic palette. Translation: My sunflowers didn't match the HOA's idea of beige-friendly landscaping. Emily brushed it off, but I started noticing a pattern. We weren't the only targets. One neighbor was written up for a slightly faded mailbox. Another was fined for having a garden gnome. People laughed about it at block parties, but there was an undercurrent of resentment, the kind you only notice if you're paying attention. Then came the RV letters. First, a reminder about driveway storage limits, then a final warning. Each one escalating in tone, signed in that tight, authoritative script Karen used like a personal watermark. I called the HOA office, explaining that I only parked it there temporarily before trips. The voice on the other end, cheerful but flat, said, "Rules were rules." I wanted to believe this was just bureaucratic overreach, that if I played along, things would cool off. But Emily's younger brother, Tyler, who'd been living with us since his anxiety disorder made independent living difficult, took it harder. He started avoiding going outside, worried that the HOA lady might scold him for something. It hit me then. This wasn't just about property regulations. This was about control, about making people small enough to fit inside someone else's idea of order, and that someone in Willow Creek was Karen. I still remember the night Emily and I sat on the back porch, string lights glowing faintly above us, debating whether to sell and move. She was tired of the constant letters, the tension. I was tired of feeling like a trespasser in my own home. But neither of us wanted to give up the life we'd built here, the friendships, the quiet mornings, the dream we'd worked so hard to afford. "We just wanted peace," Emily said softly, her hands wrapped around her mug. "Is that really too much to ask?" At the time, I didn't know how to answer her, but I knew one thing. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop on its own. If Willow Creek Estates had a beating heart, it wasn't the community park or the little pond with its token family of ducks. It was the HOA office, a squat beige building that looked more like a DMV satellite than a neighborhood hub. Inside, the air smelled faintly of toner and artificial lemon, and every wall carried a laminated poster of community standards, each one punctuated with bullet points that read less like guidelines and more like commandments. On paper, the HOA's mission was noble: maintain property values, preserve aesthetics, keep the neighborhood harmonious. But in practice, it felt less like stewardship and more like surveillance. There were the drive-by inspections, unmarked sedans crawling at 5 miles an hour, cameras snapping photos of grass a shade too brown. There were the letters, always letters, each with its polite but unmistakable threat: comply or pay. And then there was Karen, the reigning queen of the clipboard. She didn't hold an official title beyond board member, but that was like calling a dictator a civil servant. She moved through the neighborhood with the certainty of someone who believed her word was law. She wore pastel cardigans even in July, a Bluetooth headset glued to her ear, and she had an uncanny knack for appearing exactly when you least wanted her to. I once watched her intercept a teenager walking home from school to lecture him about his non-regulation skateboard stickers. Another time, she stopped mid-jog to photograph a garden hose left coiled on a front lawn. She treated the HOA bylaws like scripture, and herself as the high priestess chosen to interpret them. The rules themselves bordered on the absurd. Mailboxes could be beige, but only approved beige number 7. Decorative flags were allowed, but only during federal holidays, and only if they didn't exceed 12 square feet. And perhaps my personal favorite, seasonal decor must be removed within 48 hours of the holiday's conclusion. A regulation enforced so rigidly that I once saw Karen measuring the height of a neighbor's inflatable turkey the day after Thanksgiving. These weren't just quirks. They were the instruments of control. And under Karen's watchful eye, the HOA wasn't a passive set of guidelines. It was a living, breathing system designed to correct, punish, and, when necessary, exile. I began to see the connections. The landscaping contractor who seemed to have a monopoly on compliant yard designs was the brother-in-law of another board member. The towing company Karen had called for my RV? They also handled removals for other properties cited for code violations, and their contracts came directly through HOA referrals. Even the real estate agents who operated inside Willow Creek seemed to have a way of steering potential buyers toward houses that fit the board's vision. It wasn't paranoia. It was a network. And like any network, it thrived on keeping people in line. The problem was, most residents didn't push back. Some feared fines. Others just didn't want the trouble. A few, I suspected, actually enjoyed having Karen around, as long as her attention stayed focused on someone else. For the first year, I'd told myself I could navigate it, smile when I saw her, keep the yard neat, park the RV at my friend's property whenever possible. But every concession I made seemed to invite a new line of attack. It reminded me of something my father used to say, "Rules are fine, son, but the moment they stop protecting people and start protecting themselves, they're no longer rules. They're weapons." And in Willow Creek, Karen wielded those weapons with precision. The day she ordered the tow truck for my RV, I realized something important. This wasn't about preserving harmony. It was about preserving her control over it. And once you see the machine for what it really is, you can't unsee it. The question was no longer whether I could live with it. It was whether I was willing to. The morning after the sheriff moved my RV into Karen's driveway, I woke up to the sound of someone pounding on my door. Not knocking, pounding. Emily was still in bed, and Tyler was in the kitchen making toast. I opened the door to find Karen standing there, arms crossed, clipboard clutched like a shield. Her sunglasses were back in place, but I could see her jaw working beneath them. "You've made a serious mistake," she said, her voice low and tight. I leaned against the door frame, still in my t-shirt and sweatpants, trying to look as unimpressed as I felt. "Funny," I said. "I was about to tell you the same thing." She launched into a lecture about community integrity and the appropriate channels for dispute resolution. I let her talk. Not because I cared what she had to say, but because I wanted her to hear the silence between my responses. The silence that says, "You don't own me." When she finally stopped, I told her point blank, "You don't get to decide what happens on my property. You overstepped. That ends now." She bristled, muttered something about escalating this to the board, and stomped off. That should have been the end of it. But in neighborhoods like Willow Creek, you don't tell Karen no and expect her to retreat. The next week, I received a stack of violation notices in the mail. According to the HOA, my lawn was 0.75 inches above the acceptable height. My porch light was non-standard warm white, and my recycling bin was visible from the street for more than 6 consecutive hours. It was petty, it was targeted, and it was clearly personal. Emily was furious. Tyler started keeping his blinds closed, worried Karen might catch him doing something wrong. That's when I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. She was willing to make my family collateral damage in her little power play. That was the line. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and started writing down everything. Every letter, every interaction, every ridiculous rule. I went back through my email and phone records, noting the dates of calls to the HOA office. I took photos of every violation notice. I started recording my conversations with Karen, legally, of course. In our state, it only required one party's consent. I wasn't just going to push back. I was going to document her. When you live under a system designed to keep you quiet, your voice becomes your sharpest weapon. And mine was about to get a lot louder. I stopped avoiding Karen. If she walked by while I was in the driveway, I greeted her. If she tried to catch me off guard, I pulled out my phone and hit record right in front of her. It rattled her. Then I took it further. I started talking to neighbors, not just about my own experience, but about theirs. The more I listened, the more I realized how many people had been quietly bullied into compliance. The single mother fined for hanging her laundry out to dry. The retired couple forced to replace their shutters because they were the wrong shade of taupe. The young family threatened with legal action for building a small treehouse. Karen wasn't just overstepping with me. She was running a campaign of intimidation across the entire neighborhood. Emily, who'd been hesitant at first, started coming around. "If she's willing to go this far," she said one night, What happens if nobody stops her? I didn't have to answer. That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to play defense anymore. From then on, every encounter, every letter, every absurd accusation went into my growing file. I wasn't sure yet what I'd do with it, but I knew I was building something that could cut through her armor. Karen thought she could make me small enough to control. She was about to find out I could make her big enough for everyone to see. It's easy to think of an HOA as just a bunch of nosy neighbors with too much time on their hands. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized Willow Creek's HOA was operating like a miniature government, complete with its own enforcement arm, economic incentives, and a shadow network of alliances. The first crack in the facade came when I requested copies of all HOA meeting minutes from the past 2 years. By law, they had to provide them. Karen didn't like that. The day after I filed the request, I got a curt email from the HOA secretary. Your request has been received and will be processed within 30 business days. 30 days. For documents they probably had sitting in a filing cabinet 10 feet from their desk. When the minutes finally arrived, I spent a weekend combing through them. Most of it was standard HOA fare, budget allocations for landscaping, scheduling the annual holiday light competition, approving petty rule changes. But sprinkled in between the blandness were motions that caught my attention, authorizing special enforcement actions for repeat violators, approving exclusive contracts with the same 2 service providers year after year, voting to pursue alternative ownership options for properties in chronic non-compliance. That last one made me stop cold. Alternative ownership options sounded suspiciously like forcing people out. I decided to follow the money. Public property records showed that 3 homes in Willow Creek had been sold to a single real estate investment group in the past 18 months. Each had a history of HOA disputes. Each had been sold at a price well below the neighborhood average. And in every case, the sellers had been represented by the same real estate agent, a woman who, according to LinkedIn, was Karen's former sister-in-law. It wasn't just control, it was profit. Once I saw the pattern, I couldn't unsee it. The landscaping company that did compliance fixes, owned by a cousin of another board member, the towing company, a family friend of Karen's husband. Even the legal firm the HOA used to send out threatening letters had ties to a former HOA president. This wasn't petty neighborhood squabbling. This was a self-sustaining ecosystem, an HOA economy. And like any economy, it depended on a steady flow of violations to keep the money moving. The RV incident had been the trigger, but I started to realize I'd been marked long before that. I was a prime candidate, an owner with an asset they didn't like, the RV, a family member they could intimidate, Tyler, and just enough resistance to make them escalate. And once they escalate, they could fine, isolate, and eventually force a sale. I thought back to the first violation notice about my trash bin and how I'd brushed it off. That had been the opening move. From there, it was a predictable sequence. Minor violation, a warning to test if you'll comply without protest, increased scrutiny. More violations appear once you're on the radar. Financial pressure, fines that add up, threats of legal fees, social isolation. Neighbors start avoiding you, either because they've been warned or they don't want trouble. Forced decision, sell, settle, or fight a battle most people can't afford. They were running a playbook, and I had the playbook in my hands. I decided to test just how far their reach went. I parked my RV at a friend's house 2 miles away, well outside HOA jurisdiction. 2 days later, my friend called to tell me a woman in a pale blue SUV had been slowly circling his block, taking photos of the RV. He got the license plate. DMV records confirmed what I already suspected. It was registered to Karen's husband. They were tracking my property outside the neighborhood. That's when the fear started to turn into something sharper. Purpose. I began to map out their relationships, who was connected to who benefited from each contract, where the money flowed. I used a whiteboard in my garage, connecting names with red string like something out of a detective drama. By the time I stepped back, the picture was clear. Karen wasn't acting alone. She was the enforcer, yes, but the system was bigger than her. The board members, the service providers, the real estate connections, they all had a stake, in maintaining the cycle. And like any system, it had vulnerabilities. First, it relied on secrecy. Most residents had no idea these relationships existed. Second, it relied on fear. People stayed quiet because they didn't think anyone else would stand with them. Third, it relied on the assumption that nobody was keeping records. I was about to break all three. I created a digital archive. Every violation notice, every HOA minute, every property record, every suspicious contract. I set up a private Facebook group for Willow Creek residents and started posting anonymized case studies of what I'd found. The stories poured in. People who'd moved away wrote long, angry posts about their own experiences. Current residents started comparing notes. For the first time, the HOA wasn't the only one keeping files. And the more we shared, the less afraid people became. Karen must have sensed the shift. She started showing up less, sending others to deliver notices in her place. The official HOA newsletter went from smug reminders about keeping standards high to defensive paragraphs about misinformation being spread by disgruntled individuals. They were feeling it. I knew I couldn't dismantle the system overnight, but I could expose it. And once the machine's gears are visible, people start asking why they're turning and who they're grinding up in the process. The day I pinned the final piece of string on my whiteboard, I stepped back and thought, this isn't just my fight anymore. The strange thing about fighting someone like Karen is that, after a while, you start to think like them. I caught myself realizing it one night as I sat in the garage, staring at the whiteboard web of names and connections I'd built. My phone was on the workbench, still recording from a call with a neighbor who'd been hit with a fine for unauthorized lawn furniture. I'd already saved the audio file into a neatly labeled folder, alongside dozens of others. The evidence was growing. My strategy was working. People were coming to me instead of the HOA when they had problems. I'd become the unofficial point of resistance in Willow Creek. And then Emily said something that stopped me cold. You know, you're keeping better records than they are. She meant it as a compliment, but it hit me like a warning. Was I doing this to protect our rights? Or was I doing it to win? And if it was about winning, what exactly did that mean? Karen's power came from her ability to turn neighbors into cases, to strip away the humanity and focus only on the rules they'd broken. I was doing the same thing, just in reverse, turning her and the HOA into a collection of violations and shady connections. I wasn't thinking about people anymore. I was thinking about strategy, leverage, and the next big move. The line between defending yourself and becoming what you hate is thinner than you think. One night, I almost crossed it. I'd learned that Karen's husband ran a small contracting business. And through public records, I found he'd been late on several tax payments. Nothing criminal, but enough to embarrass him if it got around. I drafted an anonymous email ready to send it to every homeowner in the neighborhood. My finger hovered over the send button for longer than I'd like to admit. That's when Tyler walked in. He didn't see the screen. He just saw me sitting there in the glow of the laptop, tense, focused, not hearing him the first time he spoke. "You okay?" he asked. And it hit me. If I sent that email, I'd be using the same tactics Karen used on me. I'd be weaponizing technicalities, twisting the knife just because I could. I closed the laptop. I didn't need to become Karen to beat her. If I crossed that line, even once, I'd be validating everything she stood for. That night, I wrote a new rule for myself, a rule I'd stick to no matter how tempting it was to break it. I will fight them hard, but I will fight them fair. It wasn't about being noble for its own sake. It was about making sure, when this was over, I could look at myself and know I hadn't become the villain in someone else's story. Because deep down, I knew Karen's reign in Willow Creek would end. And when it did, someone else would be left to pick up the pieces. I didn't want my neighbors to see me as just another tyrant with a different clipboard, so I kept gathering evidence, but I kept it clean. No personal smears, no dragging in people's private lives, just facts, documented and undeniable. And something interesting happened. The cleaner I kept it, the more people trusted me. They knew I wasn't after revenge. I was after fairness. And that trust was worth more than any one gotcha moment I could engineer. Karen still had her loyalists, but their ranks were thinning. Every time she tried to dismiss me as a troublemaker, someone else would step up and say, "Actually, I've had the same problem." And every time that happened, I felt the tide turn just a little more. I wasn't the sheriff in this story. I wasn't the hero either. I was just the guy who decided he wouldn't be quiet and made it safe for others to speak too. And that, I decided, was enough. When you're deep in a fight like this, it's easy to think your battlefield is the whole world, that the war begins and ends on the streets you walk every day. That illusion broke for me the day I got a message from a stranger named Greg. He'd found our private Willow Creek Facebook group through a friend of a friend and sent me a simple note. "You're not the only one dealing with this. Check out Ridgeview Meadows." I did. Ridgeview Meadows was another HOA-run neighborhood about 20 miles away. Their community website looked eerily familiar. Same bland beige template, same bullet point standards, even the same boilerplate violation letters, right down to the font. I thought it was just lazy copy-pasting until Greg told me their board president had attended an HOA leadership conference last year, a networking event where HOA boards from across the state met to share best practices. In reality, it sounded more like a training camp for how to enforce, fine, and intimidate efficiently. I started digging. The conference, it turned out, was hosted by a regional HOA management company, the same company that provided consulting services to Willow Creek. They marketed themselves as experts in maximizing compliance and community value. Translation, they taught board members how to turn rules into revenue. And the tactics were identical. Start with small, easy-to-prove violations. Use escalating fines to create pressure. Leverage personal connections with service providers to profit from compliance fixes. Let's push all chronic violators towards selling, preferably to investor clients. It was a franchise model for control. The more I looked, the more communities I found running the same playbook. Pine Grove Estates, Maple Run Village, Lakeshore Heights. Each had its own Karen, sometimes a man, sometimes a whole committee, but the behavior was the same. Targeted enforcement, selective rule application, and backroom deals with contractors and real estate agents. Some residents fought back, but most gave in or moved out. The few who tried to resist often found themselves socially isolated, legally outspent, or just too exhausted to keep going. That's when I realized Willow Creek wasn't unique. It was just one tile in a much bigger mosaic. The HOA system, at least in our region, was less about maintaining communities and more about controlling them. And like any system, it was designed to protect itself first. I started reaching out to other HOA troublemakers I found online. We compared stories, documents, and strategies. One woman from Lakeshore Heights sent me a scanned contract between her HOA and a landscaping company, the same company Willow Creek used. Different neighborhood, same inflated prices, same exclusive compliance vendor clause. A man from Pine Grove told me how his board tried to ban him from attending meetings after he started recording them, a move that was flat out illegal under state law. The similarities were too consistent to be coincidence. I compiled everything into a growing dossier I called The Pattern. It wasn't just evidence against Karen or Willow Creek's board anymore. It was a map of how HOA power operated across multiple communities. When I showed Emily, she asked the question I'd been avoiding. What are you going to do with all this? I didn't have a perfect answer yet, but I knew it had to be bigger than just winning my fight. If the problem was systemic, then any victory here would be temporary unless more people knew what they were up against. And that's when a thought hit me. Karen might be the face of my battle, but she wasn't the real enemy. The real enemy was the machine that made Karen's possible. It also meant something else. Even if I took her down, the system would just replace her. Maybe not here, maybe not right away, but somewhere else, in another neighborhood, under another name. The question wasn't if another Karen would rise. It was when. And I wasn't sure yet if I wanted to spend the rest of my life chasing them. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't unsee it now. And once you see the pattern, you either walk away or you start connecting more dots. I wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. By the time summer rolled in, I had enough evidence, allies, and nerve to stop reacting and start attacking. Karen's side still controlled the board, the newsletter, and the enforcement arm, but I had something she didn't. A growing network of residents who'd stopped being afraid. It was time to move from defense to offense. For months, I'd been gathering evidence quietly, filing away every letter, every suspicious contract, every HOA minute that hinted at backroom deals. Now I started publishing them. I created a Willow Creek Watch section in our private Facebook group where I posted scans of documents with key lines highlighted. No commentary, no name-calling, just facts in black and white. People could draw their own conclusions, but I knew what they'd see. A pattern of selective enforcement and cozy contracts. Within a week, the group's membership doubled. Even people who'd never spoken out before were posting their own violation letters and contractor bills. The HOA couldn't shut down the group without looking like they had something to hide, and Karen couldn't spin every post without exhausting herself. The quiet grumbling of the neighborhood was becoming an open conversation. Karen had always relied on the HOA newsletter to control the narrative. Every month, she'd fill it with stories about community pride and maintaining standards, subtly implying that anyone who resisted was harming everyone else. So I took the fight beyond Willow Creek. I posted my story, starting with the RV tow and ending with the sheriff planting it in her driveway, on Reddit's r/fuck HOA. It went viral, thousands of upvotes, hundreds of comments. People from all over the country chimed in with their own HOA horror stories. Then local news picked it up. A short segment aired on the evening broadcast. Homeowner dispute highlights tensions in Willow Creek HOA. They didn't name Karen directly, but anyone in the neighborhood watching knew exactly who they meant. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't hers to control anymore. I'd been working with a lawyer who specialized in HOA law. We combed through every bylaw, every violation letter, and every procedural shortcut the board had taken. We found plenty. The HOA had failed to follow proper notice requirements before certain board votes. They'd approved contracts without competitive bidding, a violation of their own charter. In one case, they'd even levied a fine without the required 30-day appeal period. Individually, these were small breaches. Together, they painted a picture of systemic disregard for due process. My lawyer drafted a formal complaint to the state's HOA Oversight Division. It was clean, factual, and heavy with exhibits, the kind of document that couldn't be brushed off as the rant of a disgruntled homeowner. We didn't file it yet. Timing would matter. The final piece of my plan required someone Karen didn't recognize, someone who could get close enough to record her without setting off alarms. My neighbor, James, volunteered. He wasn't on her radar. He set up a casual coffee meeting with her under the pretense of wanting to get more involved in the HOA. For an hour, he let her talk and talk and talk. She bragged about knowing how to handle problem homeowners, hinted at her connections with certain contractors, and even laughed about how the RV situation had taught him a lesson. Though she didn't mention the sheriff part, James got it all on tape. When he sent me the file, I listened 3 times. It wasn't a smoking gun for criminal charges, but it was damning in the court of public opinion. She sounded arrogant, petty, and exactly like the caricature everyone already suspected she was. I didn't release it right away. I held it like a card in my hand, knowing that once it was out there, the fight would change. By late August, the board was under pressure from every direction, residents demanding answers in meetings, local reporters making calls, and my yet-to-be-filed legal complaint waiting in the wings. Karen tried to push back, sending letters, calling emergency board meetings, even hinting that outside agitators were trying to destabilize Willow Creek. But the more she fought, the more people saw through it. The trap was set. All I had to do now was choose the moment to spring it. The September HOA board meeting was supposed to be routine, a budget review, a landscaping update, the kind of dry agenda most residents avoided. But this time, the folding chairs in the community hall were full. People stood along the back wall, arms crossed, eyes sharp. The air was thick, like the moments before a summer storm. Karen sat at the center of the long table, flanked by the other board members, her clipboard in front of her like a shield. She wore her usual pastel cardigan, but there was a stiffness to her posture I hadn't seen before. When the floor opened for resident concerns, I was the first to stand. I'd like to address the issue of selective enforcement, I began, holding a binder stuffed with violation notices and HOA meeting minutes. I didn't raise my voice, but I projected enough for the room to hear. Over the past 18 months, this board has applied rules inconsistently, funneled work to preferred contractors without competitive bidding, and targeted certain homeowners with excessive scrutiny. A murmur rolled through the crowd. Karen leaned forward. If you have a complaint, Mr. Hall, there are proper channels. And I've tried them, I cut in, flipping open the binder. But since those channels lead right back to you, I thought it best to bring it here, where everyone can listen. I started reading excerpts from the HOA minutes, pairing them with property records and contract agreements. I showed how 3 chronic violator homes had been sold to the same investment group. I laid out the timeline of violations that escalated right after disputes with the board. Karen's smile was tight, but her eyes were darting, calculating. Then I played the recording. James's voice opened it, friendly and casual, asking how she handled non-compliant homeowners. Karen's voice followed, unmistakable, laughing about how the RV incident showed him who's in charge, bragging about steering business to contractors she trusted, and hinting that the HOA knew how to encourage sales when necessary. The room went silent except for the tinny playback from my phone. When it ended, someone in the back said loudly, "So it's true." Karen tried to regain control. "That recording is taken out of context." "No," another resident interrupted. "That's exactly the context we've been living in." Voices rose. People began standing, listing their own grievances, each one punctuating the air like hammer blows. The board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing this wasn't just my fight anymore. By the end of the meeting, a motion had been introduced and seconded to call for a special election to replace half the board. It passed with an overwhelming show of hands. Karen gathered her papers in stiff silence. She didn't look at me as she left, but I caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass door. Her face pale, her jaw set like she was already plotting her next move. I knew better than to think this was the end. But for the first time since the RV incident, the balance of power had shifted. The machine wasn't dismantled yet, but the gears had started to grind. The weeks after the showdown felt different in Willow Creek. The letters stopped. No more reminders about my lawn height, no warnings about the porch light. The RV sat tucked in a friend's barn outside the neighborhood, but for the first time, I knew it could come back without triggering a war. Karen was quieter too. She still showed up at board meetings, still wore her pastel armor, but her voice didn't carry the same unquestioned authority. The special election loomed, and she could feel the ground shifting beneath her. For me, though, it wasn't about whether she lost her seat. Somewhere along the way, the fight had stopped being about winning and started being about living without the constant hum of tension in my own home. One Saturday morning, Emily and I were on the porch with our coffee. The air was crisp, the kind that hints at autumn. Tyler was in the yard tossing a ball for our neighbor's dog. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I'd seen him relaxed like that. "I think we've got our peace back," Emily said. I nodded. "Yeah, at least for now." That afternoon, I did something small but important. I planted a row of sunflowers along the side fence, the same ones Karen had once told me were non-compliant with the community aesthetic. I didn't plant them to provoke her. I planted them because I wanted them there, because it was my yard, my soil, and my choice. It was a quiet act, but it felt like reclaiming ground that had been taken piece by piece. Neighbors started stopping by again. We had a barbecue one evening, and for the first time in months, people lingered without glancing nervously toward the street. Laughter carried past the hedges. The place felt like a neighborhood again, not a monitored zone. I still kept the binder, still had the recordings, the contracts, the timeline, not out of spite, but because I knew the system Karen operated in didn't disappear just because she'd been knocked down a peg. Maybe she'd try again. Maybe someone else would step up to fill her shoes. But if they did, I'd be ready. For now, I just wanted the sound of Tyler laughing in the yard, the smell of Emily's coffee, the slow way the sunflowers turned their heads toward the light each morning. The fight had taught me something about power, how it hides in plain sight, how it feeds on silence, how it turns communities into fiefdoms. But it had also taught me something about myself. I didn't need to control the board or topple the system in one blow. I just needed to make sure my home stayed mine. As the sun set that evening, I sat on the porch and listened to the cicadas starting their night song. The air was still, calm. The kind of calm you notice because you've lived without it for too long. And I realized that was enough. A month after the special election, the neighborhood gossip mill picked up again. Not about Willow Creek this time, but about a community 20 miles away. Lakeshore Heights. The story was almost comically familiar. A homeowner fined for unauthorized holiday decorations, a dispute over a driveway repair, escalating letters, and then the kicker, an RV. It wasn't my RV, but the parallels were uncanny. Same tactics, same escalation, same chilling language in the violation notices. Curious, I pulled up their HOA's board roster. The names meant nothing to me until I saw the Community Relations Liaison. It wasn't Karen's name, but the email address, same domain as hers. The phone number, just one digit off from the one she'd used here. I sat back in my chair, letting it sink in. The machine hadn't stopped. It had just shifted gears. And Karen, or someone just like her, was already putting the playbook into motion in a new neighborhood. Part of me wanted to call the Lakeshore Heights residents right then, send them my entire binder, warn them about what was coming. Another part of me knew that people rarely believe the storm is real until they feel the wind for themselves. Choices like this aren't accidents. They're cycles. They adapt, survive, and find new ground to claim. I looked out at my sunflowers, tall and defiant along the fence line. The yard was quiet, but the quiet felt temporary. Maybe someday I'd step in again, maybe not. But I knew one thing. I'd keep my binder close, my notes sharp, and my eyes open. Because in places like Willow Creek and Lakeshore Heights and Pine Grove and a dozen other communities I'd never seen, the game never really ends. It just gets a new name, a fresh coat of approved beige number 7, and another Karen ready to pick up the clipboard. If there's one thing I've learned from this fight, it's that no one really understands what an HOA can become until they've been in its crosshairs. On paper, it's all about protecting property values and keeping the neighborhood beautiful. In reality, it can turn into a system that thrives on fear, silence, and the slow erosion of your right to feel at home in your own home. My story started with an RV. Yours might start with a garden, a mailbox, a fence that's half an inch too tall. It might start with something so small you think, I'll just fix it and move on. But sometimes that small thing is just the first step in a game you never agreed to play. And here's the truth. You're not alone. I've heard from people in every corner of the country who've lived this same story. Different streets, different Karens, but the same playbook. And every time one of us speaks up, it makes it harder for these systems to hide behind polished newsletters and legal jargon. So I'm asking you, tell your story, post it, record it, share it with your neighbors. You never know who's quietly waiting for someone else to go first. Because change doesn't happen when one person wins. It happens when enough people decide they've had enough. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us speak out, the next person who tries to run a neighborhood like their own personal fiefdom will think twice before picking up that clipboard.